The morning Eulalie Finch woke to the sound of the smokehouse door yawning in the wind, the kitchen already smelled like the day would lie. She lay still on the thin pallet in the scullery, listening for the cough of the overseer's wife, the heavy steps of Tom Brass's boots, the rustle of hens in the yard as dark slid toward a gray that wouldn't admit to being dawn. She counted the bird calls without moving, 2 whip-poor-wills fading, the lonely warble of a thrush, because numbers steadied her when words had to stay hidden. The words were always there, though, tucked like embroidery on the underside of the cloth, recipes in her head with measures that no one taught her, verse scraps she'd filched from a mildewed almanac, names of plants that had other names in the mouths of the enslaved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Eulalie rose in the quiet and knotted her hair with the strip of blue calico she kept hidden in the churn, the one piece of color she would allow herself. The yard beyond the kitchen door wore a skin of dew, the well rope looked furred with it. She pulled water and lifted the bucket slow so it would not creak, watching her own breath rise like the mist off the trough. In that breath she repeated her morning lesson, the one letter she allowed herself to say in the open air, A, for ash, for almond, for the angles of a life she was shaping under other people's roofs. Tom Brass pretended to have Christ nailed to both hands. He walked like a man always arriving late and angry at whoever had the nerve to be on time. He liked his bacon black and his eggs trembling, and he liked to remind Eulalie that if she burned his Sunday cake again he'd set her to field work until her fingers forgot what butter felt like. She nodded when he said these things, and afterward, when the kitchen was empty, she wrote a recipe for his voice in her head and set it to boil on the slowest fire she could make. It began the way patience begins, with small measurements, 1 handful of feigned silence, 2 pinches of safe answers, a sprig of looking below instead of looking up. It needed time, and time was made of chores. She swept the ashes from the hearth and set the Dutch oven to warm. She split lard into the skillet and watched it melt to a glistening mirror that showed her face as it might look if laughter had been a habit here. She knew better than to smile at a mirror. Mirrors were for the house, the scullery held reflections in spoons and puddles and the glassy stare of an onion's cut surface. The first word she ever read all the way through was from a crate of salt cod, Bacalao. She had traced the letters with a damp finger when no one watched, mouthing them until they felt like kernels in her cheek. Later she found an almanac with its corners chewed by rats and a prayer book missing all the prophets, and she learned the shape of months, the meaning of harvest moons, the trick of keeping numbers lined like fence posts in a mind that must never admit to a fence it could climb. If she read, she cooked better. If she cooked better, she moved in the house more than the fields, and the house had shadows wide enough for thinking. There was the matter of the baby, too. Not Eulalie's, she had kept her body hers by a constantly shifting geography of absence, but the overseer's second child with his wife, Alma. A damp-cheeked, red-fisted thing called Joseph with the eyes of any infant, which is to say eyes that did not yet know what to be afraid of. He had arrived in a scream of winter and lived, which made him a miracle, though Tom spoke of him as a ledger entry finally posted. Alma seemed to love him the way thirsty grass loves a rain barrel. Eulalie rocked him in the afternoon while the older child, Ruthie, rubbed her face on the muslin apron Eulalie wore, as if trying to wipe away what she did not yet have the words to describe. If there was a mercy in those days, it was that the overseer's wife was more vain than cruel. Alma wore a ribbon even in heat and was always seeking a novel proof of her refinement, lace for the mantle, a Mary pie at a luncheon for wives of neighboring planters, a syllabub whose froth stood as stiff as church hair. This made her greedy for Eulalie's talent. Alma liked, too, that Eulalie knew the names of things Alma could pronounce at the table to impress guests, and in this way Eulalie's secret letters became a currency that bought her access to rooms with unlocked windows. The rooms had walls. The walls had ears. The ears belonged to Tom Brass and his hired men, to Alma's sister who visited and complained about the dust and letters she sealed with wax that smelled of violets, to Mr. Vivian, the planter who owned people the way a ledger owns unpaid sums, who came once a week with a face like a river rock and a pocket watch he checked even when there was no time to check. The watch had a chain. The chain dazzled Eulalie because in it she saw the law of the place, polished, looped, meant to bind, and beautiful enough to make even the bound admire it. Eulalie did not admire. Admiration was a luxury like oranges, and she had long ago learned to squeeze the bitterness for what sugar it could yield. She admired only skill where skill meant survival. She admired her own hands for their memory of heat, the way they could tell by the sting at her fingertips when caramel had turned, the way they could rescue a sauce that had broken by whispering to it with the back of a spoon. She admired the way a blade became an instrument of kindness in the moment it divided tomatoes without bruising them. She admired, in a hushed and reverent way, the little cabinets of her mind where she stored words for later, alum, agrimony, angelica, and certain other A-words that few whites used and that older women whispered like shields. The garden beyond the smokehouse grew not only the planter's vegetables but certain herbs which had been planted before Eulalie was born and would live after any of them. They hid under larger leaves or braided themselves into hedges to look harmless. She turned the soil with a careful foot when no one watched and touched the roots as if asking them for their true names. Foxglove wore the face of a saint but had a soldier's heart. Nightshade smiled like a girl who'd learned to keep her teeth hidden. Wild Carrot, Queen Anne's lace, was a fool's twin to poison hemlock. Eulalie stored these in a part of her mind that had no windows. In the evenings, by the wash kettle, Eulalie whispered with Dory and Big May and a boy called Harlan who slept in the loft above the tack and dreamed of a horse he would ride towards a line on the horizon that did not move. They spoke low in the thrum of bugs so that the sound was more vibration than word. They spoke of a man 3 plantations over who had written his own pass and walked north and had only been caught because he tried to bring his mother after. They spoke of knees bent in trees with babies to quiet. They did not speak of poisoning because that word was watched by more than walls, it was watched by the wind. They spoke, instead, of recipes that the wind might allow, recipes for slipping chains, for making men drop their whips by making other men look at them too long, for stretching a piece of smoked hog so thin it became 2 days of hope. Sometimes after the pots were scrubbed, Eulalie took the ash cakes she'd saved in her apron and walked to the quarters to share. She stepped around puddles that held moonlight like something caught and sloshing. She passed a pine where Jeremiah once hid and scratched marks on the bark that only made sense to him, 4 lines, a space, 3 lines, a space, then nothing, like a song with missing words. He was gone now, sold, said some, drowned, said others, but his marks remained, which taught Eulalie that where the body cannot dwell, the sign might. When she lay on her pallet, Eulalie read the day back to herself. The reading was not a prayer, prayers made claims on a heaven that so far had shown no inclination to appear, but it had the shape of one. She named the things that could be used and the things that must be avoided, the way Tom counted the hogsheads when he was drunk and miscounted higher, the way Alma stored the sugar in a tin near the hearth even in summer, the way Ruthie stared too long at the fire, as if trying to memorize the language flame speaks. She stored these like spices, tight-lidded, dry, labeled only in a mind that pretended not to read. The day the mail coach broke an axle on the road beyond the stand of Poplar, Alma entertained the repairman at the long table and Eulalie sent out bowls of hot onion soup slicked with a whisper of cream. Tom ate with his mouth open and told the men that he could have fixed the axle quicker if he'd been asked. They laughed the way men laugh when laughter is what they have instead of respect. Eulalie watched the coachman's hands, thick with callus and stained with pitch, and thought about wheels, how one spoke gone wrong could bring everything to its knees, how a cart moving too fast made a sound like a throat clearing to summon courage, how a circle, if held still, looks like a coin and feels like a promise. She folded pastry that afternoon for Alma's company tart, gooseberries and thin slivers of preserved citron, and arranges of thyme and lemon peel that would permit Alma to say phrases like subtlety and palate. As she worked, she practiced reading the recipe she had tucked under the flour bin, a page torn from a Charleston lady's household book that had traveled here wrapped around a jar of raisins. The letters swam a bit where grease had spotted them, but Eulalie steadied them with her finger, hiding the page each time anyone entered. To read under threat is to teach letters to walk fast. The recipe did not matter. The fact that letters yielded when she demanded it, that mattered. That evening, Dory came to the kitchen with a basket of eggs and a bruise that looked like a map of the coast. She put the basket down and looked at Eulalie the way people look at someone they have chosen to trust without knowing why. "You here talk?" Dory asked, voice small as a moth. They say Mr. Vivian wanna send 10 head south come winter. 2 from here. Eulalie did not ask who they meant by head. She knew. Who they say? Father-in-law to the store man up by the creek. He say Vivian been at cards and lost. He ain't a man who like to owe. He sell some of us to make square. The kitchen felt suddenly like a mask over a face that was screaming. Eulalie kept her own face smooth and pulled a cloth to cover the bowl of dough. You eat? She asked. Can't yet, Dory said. He watching. She did not have to say who he was. Tom was a kind of weather, and you could feel him even when he was not in the room. That night Eulalie could not read the day into sense. The letters would not line up. They hopped like frogs near a pond's edge. She lay awake and counted the ways a person gets south, in chains, by river, on a page stamped with someone else's rights. In the dark she sat up and pressed her palms together. Her hands were warm with the memory of the day's fire. She imagined them cupped around something very small and very bright. She did not know its name yet, but she recognized the heat, choice. In the morning, she knelt to draw water and found Harlan waiting at the well with a face so set it might have been carved. Miss Eula, he said. He was the only one who called her that. Dory gone. Eulalie gripped the bucket handle. The iron bit into her fingers. Gone where? He shrugged like a man does when he is trying not to shake. They took her, night. Tom and 2 men. Say she steal. Say she talk back. Took her to the big house. I ain't seen her come out. The bucket banged against the well's stone throat and sent up a sound like a church bell heard from inside a lake. Eulalie felt the sound ring her bones. She lifted the bucket and poured water into the trough and stood looking at the dazzle of it because looking at something shining made it harder to cry. Alma sent for her not an hour later. Eulalie, she said in the bright room where the morning light turned the dust to gold coins in the air. We are to have guests tomorrow evening. Mr. Vivian has business. There will be 6. No, 8. Mr. Vivian will send their names on a card. He says he wants a proper supper. I told him you could do clear turtle and capon with Angelica, and a trifle, and, oh, those little cakes the color of spring grass. I know they were peas, you said once. How curious. But I do love a novelty. Eulalie curtsied the way Alma liked. Yes'm. She kept her voice smooth. Novelty, she thought, is what a fox calls the henhouse door. On her way out, she passed Tom in the hall. He smelled like sweat and pennies. You make sure that soup ain't thin like last time, he said, though the soup had not been thin last time, he had spilled it with his elbow and called it fault. Men comin' with money don't like poor man's broth. Yes, sir, she said. She had learned to call him sir the way one caged thing will sing to calm another. Back in the kitchen, she pulled her notebook from the place she hid it, not an actual book, but an old rag folded into itself where she had stitched letters on the inside with hair pulled from her own head. She ran her fingers over the stitches and felt the raised bumps like braille she had invented. On the first layer, a list of dishes that Alma liked to hear pronounced. On the second, a list of plants. On the third, a word she had given herself permission to write once only and never again, freedom. She set about the work as if it could be done without thinking. That is the way to think without being seen. She sent Harlan to the river for turtles, knowing he would bring back not the great greens for the planters' clear soup but the snappers she could coax into a strength broth for those who would need it. She asked Big May to fetch a sack of field peas. She cut stale loaves for crumbs and set out eggs in 2 bowls, one for the table and one for the people whose mouths the table forgot. She blanched almonds until their skins slipped off like little stockings and dried the nuts in the low oven. She told Alma's Ruthie to bring her bunches of bright Angelica, and when the girl returned proud with a handful, Eulalie praised her and took, with fingers that were praising also, one thin stem of something else that had come up among the Angelica. The something else was not dangerous by itself. It was a cousin wearing borrowed clothes, and Eulalie knew better than to trust cousins. She tucked it under the cutting board and kept working. A recipe is a path, and paths have forks. That night, at the wash kettle, Eulalie said to Big May, "You ever hear of folk eating wild seeds when hunger sharp?" Big May snorted. "I hear of folk eatin' wild anything when hunger sharp. I hear of folk eatin' words when hunger sharp, and the words go down like glass. What if a person had to choose between hunger and a different kind of pain?" Big May stopped ringing and looked at her long. "You talkin' out the side your mouth, girl. Say it plain." Eulalie swallowed. The smoke from the kettle folded into her mouth like a handkerchief. "If he mean to sell Dory. If he mean to sell more. If a person had to make a thing happen to stop a bigger thing." Big May's face moved through three weathers: storm, sun, a wind that couldn't decide. "You know the old tales," she said finally. "Some things you do, they never get done. They sit with you and eat at your table till you gone." "I know," Eulalie said. "I know I don't want to feed them." Big May looked into the water where a piece of moon had fallen. "You gotta count the costs like you count cups of flour. You smart enough to know which spoon you usin'. But don't you think you can stir for yourself alone?" "I don't," Eulalie said, and it was true. When she breathed now, she heard more than one chest moving. The day of the supper rose with a pale, ungenerous sun. Eulalie built her fires slow. She laid out her knives and honed them until they sang when she touched them to the stone. She took the turtles Harlan had brought and prepared 2 broths, one for the house, one for the hands, simmering the house pot with care until it burned off its foam like an offering. She trussed the capons and rubbed them under the skin with herb butter until they looked shiny as new coins. She sugared Angelica to lay like little roads between candied citrus peel. She set peas to boil with salt pork and a bay leaf that had been in the house so long it tasted more of dust than laurel. Mr. Vivian arrived in the afternoon with his pocket watch winking and his face paler than usual, which meant he had been drinking. With him came men whose voices were made for auction blocks. They spoke in prices even when they meant to speak about weather. Alma fluttered and fussed and ran her hand over the mantel lace as if smoothing it could smooth her guest's roughness. Tom swaggered and told a story about a woman he had caught stealing a ribbon, leaving out the part where he had stolen the ribbon first by promising it to a girl and then not giving it to her. Eulalie kept to the corridor of the kitchen door and the butler's pantry, a river crossing and recrossing between heat and polished cool. She tasted the sauces. She salted the turtle clear soup until it raised the ache at the back of her tongue that told her it was right. She set out a small dish and put in it a spoonful of syrup she had made from Angelica stems and sugar that did not belong to her. She opened the drawer where she kept cloths and lifted out the sliver she had tucked away, the cousin herb, dried now to a quiet-looking slat. She powdered it between the heel of her hand and the counter, feeling the grit disintegrate, feeling the last chance to stop dissolve with it. Her heart beat not fast but hard. It had learned long ago to move like a drum used to call a dance you must not attend, steady and low. She set the powder aside in a folded bit of paper, one corner of the Charleston recipe, a neat sin, and slid the packet into the pocket of her apron. She thought of the baby's damp fist. She thought of Ruthie's stare at the fire. She thought of Dory's absence as if absence were a place you could point to on a map. She thought that a recipe is a choice laid out in lines, and if you follow it without asking whose book it came from, you deserve what it feeds you. The first course went out. Alma stood in the doorway admiring the clarity of the broth, praising Eulalie's steady hand to her guests as if Eulalie were a kitchen utensil with a reliable spring. The men sipped and made approving noises. Tom slurped and elbowed Mr. Vivian, who did not smile. He was watching the hall, as if waiting for someone late to his own business. Eulalie felt the room through the hinge of the door the way a person feels weather in their bones. She could have named the timbre of each voice with her eyes closed. She could have placed each spoon on the table by sound alone. Between courses, Harlan darted in, eyes bright in a face that had learned to be dark for safety. "Miss Eula," he whispered. "Dory. She in the cellar." "How you know?" "Saw Tom take down bread. 2 times. He don't take bread down. He eat in hall." "Who with her?" Eulalie asked. He shook his head. "Don't know. But I hear her cough. She ain't quiet. A cough like a signal fire." Eulalie's mind flipped its cabinets open. Air. Food. Locks. Keys. Men with guns. Women with hands. Children who cry because they are supposed to. She heard Big May's voice, "Don't you stir for yourself alone." She added the powder to the Angelica syrup. She stirred until it looked like light caught in amber. She touched a finger to it and put the finger to her tongue and tasted nothing but the licorice whisper of the stem. She felt a pang of terror so pure she could have used it to whiten linens. She set the little dish aside. The capons went out, glossy and smelling of Sundays that better lives are made of. Alma cooed. The men carved with the peculiar tenderness cruelty sometimes shows at table. They praised the crisp skin. They called Eulalie an artist the way a man might call a horse a beauty before whipping it to make it run. Eulalie counted how many drank the claret and how quickly. She watched Tom refill his own cup as if it were proof of his importance. In the lull before the trifle, she filled a tray with little green cakes, pea cakes that had become a trick of spring color, and set them around the dish of Angelica syrup. The syrup gleamed politely. The cakes waited like a field at midday, pretending to be harmless. Eulalie had planned to carry the tray herself. She had planned to place it on the table with her steady hands and watch each man's face and take back the tray when she had counted enough. But when she moved to lift it, Alma swept in like a gust of stitches and ribbons. "Oh! The pretty cakes," she cried, not looking. "Let me present, it will please Mr. Vivian to see something novel from my kitchen." And before Eulalie could raise a word, Alma took the tray and glided through the doorway, the Angelica dish humming like a hive of bees under her fingers. Eulalie stood against the shelf and felt her knees try to become water. The door breathed shut behind Alma. In the breath of the door was a century. Eulalie turned to Harlan, who had slipped in and watched with his mouth open. "Go," she said, in a voice she had never heard herself use, quiet and flint. "See if the cellar door locked." He vanished. Eulalie dried her hands on the apron she would be buried in if need be. She lifted the second dish of syrup, the one she had held back, pure, and put it on a second tray. She took from the shelf a spoon bright as a church bell. She moved toward the door. From the dining room came a chorus of appreciative sounds. Silver chimed. Alma laughed, high and pleased. Mr. Vivian's voice threaded the others, low and cutting, as if he were slicing something invisible. Tom said, "Ain't that a lick of spring?" and the men laughed, and it sounded like frogs on a bank after rain, loud and mindless. Harlan returned, breathless. Locked. Key on a ring at Tom's belt. He swallowed. "I can't get it, Miss Eula." "You can," she said, and put her hand on his head as if anchoring him to the earth. "But not yet." She thought of Ruthie, of the baby, of Dory coughing in the dark. She thought of the powder already among men's mouths. She thought, there are many ways to stop a body from harm. Some of them require that other bodies be paid. She stepped into the dining room. The room glanced at her, not with eyes, but with the flurry of attention that follows a servant like a draft. Alma stood at the head of the table beaming as if she'd baked the cakes herself. The men had dipped the green squares into the amber syrup and were chewing with the solemnity people grant small delights. Tom licked his fingers. Mr. Vivian did not dip, he was toying with the watch chain, eyes on the hall. There was an empty chair at his right, a chair that had been set with more care than the others. A napkin had been folded into a little boat upon its plate. "More syrup, ma'am," Eulalie said, careful to glance not quite at Alma, careful to make her voice a sound that could mean anything. She set the second dish down by Alma's elbow with the bright spoon. Alma, noticing not the swap but the shine, exclaimed, "Oh! How very fine," and replaced the first dish without looking. Eulalie lifted the first dish as if making a courtesy to the table and turned. "Hold a moment," Mr. Vivian said. His voice was soft and cut through the others like a knife slicing cold fat. "There is a guest yet to arrive." He lifted the watch. "He is late." Eulalie's muscles forgot how to pretend. "Shall I keep warm she began. "The law keeps itself warm," he said, smiling. No, Mrs. Brass, do continue. We cannot let trifles wait for justice. Alma laughed, confused. The men laughed because Alma did. Tom sat back and patted his belly. Ain't that the truth, he said, and the watch winked, and Eulalie's fingers cramped on the dish she held. Justice had a chair at the table and might answer to any name. She returned to the kitchen and set the dangerous dish in the cold hearth, as if it were a baby set aside to sleep. She did not touch it again. She took up the ladle for the trifle. She reached for the bottle of sherry and poured the measured sweet along the ladyfingers in their glass bowl, watching the sponge go gold and soft, thinking how something humble drinks liquor and becomes company. She whipped the cream so that it stood just shy of peaks. She layered it careful, as if building a thing that might be climbed. When the trifle went out, the empty chair was no longer empty. A man sat there with a badge pinned under his coat, a shine on his boots, and a way of lifting his spoon that said he had been taught to eat as if his mouth were not connected to the rest of him. Eulalie knew such mouths. They were the kind that could speak a sale and then comment on the tang of candied peel. "Sheriff," Mr. Vivian said, his voice made of velvet and hooks. "Glad you could join us." "Road's a misery," the man said. He did not look at Eulalie. He did not look anywhere a conscience might be. He dug his spoon into the trifle and said, "Fine work," to the room at large. Eulalie counted the spoons as they dipped. She counted the men without counting Mr. Vivian because he did not dip the cakes, and the sheriff who had dipped everything since he sat. She counted Tom twice, once for his mouth and once for his belt where the keys hung. She counted Alma, who tasted everything that reminded her of newspapers she'd read aloud to herself. She counted Ruthie hidden under the table. Eulalie felt the child like a field mouse in the walls, slipping a finger along the underside of the cloth and licking the trifle that stuck there. When the dishes came back, Eulalie stacked them. The room pulsed with the satisfied murmur that follows a conquered meal. The men talked of auctions and reigns and how far a man might be expected to ride in a day if he was the sort inclined to consider others' needs. The sheriff told a story about catching a boy who had made himself a raft and believed that drifting would choose him a fate where his feet could not. In the kitchen, Harlan whispered, "Miss Eula, his belt." She nodded. "Not yet," she said. She poured water into the dishpan and watched steam rise like a ghost that might be persuaded to take a message. She listened for coughs. She counted heartbeats. The first sound came from the corridor, small and abrupt, like a fork dropped on a wooden floor. Then a chair scraped. Then Alma's voice, bright and pitched too high, "Oh!" Then Tom's laugh, which turned itself into a cough in the middle and could not decide again what to be. Eulalie stood very still. She felt the kitchen breathe. Noise rolled through the hall like a cart over gravel. Mr. Vivian's voice cut across it, steady as a road. "Gentlemen," he said. "We will retire to the porch for air." The sheriff said something Eulalie could not hear. Eulalie did not move. Harlan's hand found her sleeve. "Now," he breathed. She looked at the door. She thought of the baby asleep upstairs, of Ruthie under the table, of Dory coughing in the dark. She thought of the dish cooling in the hearth like a secret she could not unmake. She thought, a recipe is a path, but even a path can be left if you know the wood. She nodded once. "Now," she said. "Quick." They moved as a body that had been separated and was finding itself. Harlan slid into the corridor like a slip of paper under a door. Eulalie followed with a pitcher on a tray as if delivering water to someone who had been overcome by heat. The hallway smelled of claret and fear. Alma stood wringing her hands by the parlor door, calling Tom. Tom, as if the name itself could perform a miracle in public the way it performed small torments in private. On the porch, the men stood in a loose knot. The sheriff leaned on the rail, green about the gills. Tom was laughing again, too loud, as men do when their bodies are taking decisions away from their minds. Mr. Vivian spoke low to Alma, who bobbed like a cork in a brown river. Eulalie kept her eyes on Tom's belt. The keys hung like dull teeth. She moved near him as if to offer the pitcher, and when he waved her off with a sweep of his hand, she made herself stumble so that the tray tilted and a slick of water went cooling down his front. "Watch yourself," he barked, leaping back. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, and the sir tasted like iron. Her hand brushed the keys. They clicked against one another, a polite conversation. She lifted them with 2 fingers and curved them into her palm. She stepped back, eyes down, taking the pitcher to the rail to pour the rest into the geraniums as cover. Her heart beat not in her chest but in her wrists. In the parlor, Rufus, the hired man with a hump in his shoulder from a boyhood fall, stepped toward her. "You need help with the washing up?" he asked, which meant, you need a witness. You need a delay? You need someone to say he saw you in one place while you were in another? She shook her head once, small. He nodded once, big. Sometimes a no is a yes to the right person. She walked back through the hall as if she had forgotten something. She passed Alma, who was pressing a damp cloth to her own forehead for drama. "Fetch the salts," Alma said to Eulalie, and Eulalie said, "Yes, and took the stairs." At the top of the cellar stairs, the air changed. The house's breath was cooler there, flavored with soil and old brick and the lemon cut of lye. She fitted the key to the lock and turned. The sound it made was not loud, but it went through her like a bell rung close. She opened the door and slipped in, shutting it behind her until only a blade of light remained. "Dory," she whispered. "Here," came the voice, hoarse and brave at once. "He say he sell me tomorrow." I spit and I laugh and I tell him he sell himself first on account he's so full of misery ain't nobody buy. A cough ribboned the words. He did not laugh. Eulalie moved toward the sound. She found the shape of Dory, warm, shaking, by the feel of rope. She set her mouth to the knot and wet it and pushed with her tongue the way she would loosen a stubborn cork from a bottle. Her fingers worked blind as spiders do. The rope gave in its small ways. Above, a chair scraped. Below, breath braided. "Harlan," she whispered. He was there, light as dust at her shoulder. "Stand by the door," she said. "If you hear steps, cough like the night." He did. The cough rose from him like fog from a river. It sounded like illness you cannot sell. It sounded like something a man would rather not go down into the dark to touch. The steps passed. The rope eased. Dory's wrists were free. Eulalie pushed the door with her foot and let in a wedge of light. "Can you stand?" she asked. "Can stand till I fall," Dory said, and did not. Eulalie put her shoulder under Dory's arm. Harlan took the other side. Together they went up, breath by breath, the way people climb from a story into another one they have decided to write. At the landing, Eulalie closed the door and turned the key slowly until she felt the lock take its lesson. "Where?" Harlan breathed. "Smokehouse," Eulalie said. "Then the hedge. Then the ditch past the sycamore. Then the place we talked of that we never named." They moved through the hallway in the seam of the house's attention. On the porch, laughter tried to be king, but it was losing its crown. Alma was saying, "Tom, sit down," the way a wife pleads with a dog and a man at once. Mr. Vivian's watch ticked so loud Eulalie could hear it in her teeth. At the smokehouse, they pressed into the cool and the scent of swung meat. Harlan slid the bolt and stood outside like a stick nobody would notice. Inside, Dory sagged against a salt barrel and let a soft sound out that was not a sob and was not yet a laugh. Eulalie took her face in her hands. "Listen," she said. "We go now or we go never. There been a change to the recipe. I can't unmake it. Some men go pay for all they taken. I don't know which. I don't know how soon." Dory's eyes, in the dim, were the shine of wet stones. "You did it," she said, and in the words was not fear but a taste like iron turned to strength. "You." "Don't say it," Eulalie said. Words got ears. They slipped out the back and into the hedges. The grass hissed with insects who did not care for human plans. A shard of moon balanced on the well curb like a coin someone could not decide to spend. Harlan went ahead to test the shadows for holes. Dory put her feet where Eulalie put hers, and in this way they became a train, engine, car, caboose, rolling toward a line drawn on the dark with spit and hope. Behind them, in the house, a chair went over. The sound carried clean. A man cursed. Another joined him. Feet spoke to the floor in the language of trouble. The night took the voices and shook them in its hands like bones for a foretelling. At the sycamore, they dropped into the ditch and crawled the way you do when the earth is wiser than your spine. The ditch smelled of wet and old leaves. Frogs watched them with the moon in their eyes and did not judge. When they came up on the far side, Harlan made a sound in his throat that was warning and wonder mixed. Eulalie froze. She tasted metal. She heard hoofbeats. A rider came into the yard at a pace too glad for the hour. He was young, and his hat cocked reckless. He called out a halloo that made the porch answer with relief. The sheriff stepped forward and clapped him on the back. "You're late," Mr. Vivian said, but he was smiling finally, and the watch stopped warming his hand and began to rest. The young man laughed and swung down and said, "Had to fetch something from the bridge," and he lifted a sack the size of a man's head as if to show them the bigness of his errand. Eulalie felt the world tilt. If that sack held what she thought it might, if the bridge had given up a runaway's bundle, a letter, a tool, then the night had more than one recipe at work. She looked at Harlan. He looked at her. They did what cooks do when the oven fails, they recalculated heat with their bones. "Go," she whispered, and they went into the deeper dark, where the hedge let out and the field began, and the field warned with its low hum that it told wet stories to the feet that trod it. They crossed like ghosts that had learned to make no mark. By the creek they stopped to listen. The frogs had opinions. The water argued with stones. Eulalie heard, close and small, the sound a child's shoe makes when its strap is coming loose. She turned. Ruthie stood there, cheeks streaked with cream from stolen trifle, hair wild like a corn tassel. In her hand, she held the napkin boat from the empty chair, folded and refolded until it was a worry stone. "Miss Lally," she whispered. "I seen you take keys. I ain't tell." She looked proud. Then the pride collapsed and fear sat down hard in its place. "They mad. Pa say a word I don't know. Ma cry. The lawman got sick in the yard, he did, right in Mama's geraniums." Her eyes filled. "Is Dory bad?" Eulalie crouched so Ruthie's face and hers made a circle of breath. "Dory with me," she said. "You go back now. Go to the baby. Don't look out the window. Hold him. Sing him the song of the white boat that floats whether or not somebody gives it permission." Ruthie nodded, serious as bread. "I ain't tell," she said again, and then she pressed the folded napkin into Eulalie's palm. "For keep," she said, and ran lightly away as if the earth loved her feet. Eulalie opened the napkin with one hand and found inside a sliver of paper with a seal broken and the words of a past Mr. Vivian had written for a man not Dory. It was dated this very day. The man's name had been scraped and redrawn. The letters were shaky, as if written by a hand that learned under a whip and had not yet forgiven the lesson. The past was a shape that could accept new names. "Mercy," Eulalie breathed, not to God but to the dark. She folded the paper and stuffed it into the seam of her bodice. They followed the creek to where it widened and pretended to be a river. On the far bank, willows made a screen of hair. Past them, the road lay like a belt thrown down. Sometime before dawn, men would think to search here. Sometime before dawn, the house would rise like a struck hive. "Now or never," Eulalie said. "Hold your breath when you be afraid to breathe. Count in your head. Count like you stirring. Count like letters that got to walk fast and quiet." They stepped into the creek. The first chill climbed their legs like a warning and then became a fact. Harlan moved first, light as a thought you might deny if you needed to. Dory moved next, her breath punching in and out the way a loom does when it finds its rhythm again. Eulalie followed, the pass against her heart like a small drum. Halfway across, they heard the shout. Not at them, yet, but at the night, the way men shout when afraid their orders are smaller than the dark. A gun cracked and the crack traveled the water like a thrown plate. Eulalie did not look back. She counted. She put her foot where stones did not bruise. She held Dory higher by the elbow when the bottom fell out for a step. She told herself the story of a woman who cooks and counts and reads, who keeps a blue calico not for courage, who collects recipes of survival, who writes one word with hair, freedom, and feeds it until it grows teeth. On the far bank, they fell into the willows and lay there panting in breaths that dared not become sound. Harlan's fingers shook like leaves. Dory coughed into her skirt. Eulalie pressed her palm to the pass under her bodice and felt the damp of river and sweat and fear. In the yard behind them, a man cried out, and the cry had not the tone of outrage but the low surprise of a body remembering it is mortal. Alma screamed, a thin ribbon of noise. Mr. Vivian spoke a word to silence the porch. The sheriff shouted orders to make himself into a structure he could live inside. Tom cursed. The sound of dogs waking gathered like thunder before rain. Eulalie pushed up. "We move," she said, though her legs were shaking. "Now." Before the dogs got the story straight. They moved. The road on this side was sand and quiet. The trees crowded it as if they were ashamed to be seen by roads. They walked in the ditch. Harlan went ahead, growing larger with each step into a man who might yet ride a horse toward a horizon line that does not move away. Dory kept pace like a woman measuring out what she had left and finding to her own surprise that it was enough. Eulalie carried a second story against her ribs, a dish and a hearth cooling, a tray moved by a vain hand, a little girl with cream on her chin and a boat of folded cloth, a watch that had measured everything but mercy. They had almost reached the stand of cypress that marked the path to the place they had never named when the hounds' voices braided together into a rope that could be thrown and pull a person back through distance with only sound. The rope found them. It found Eulalie in the place behind her knees. It pulled there. She stopped. "Run," Harlan hissed. "No," Eulalie said. "Not yet. They run us down if we straight. We got to bend." She pointed to the cypress. "Water there. Mud. We walk it. We be trees." They stepped into the ooze and let it take their ankles like hands. They pressed their bodies to the green smell. They slowed until time forgot them for a moment. The hounds cried like trumpets calling a dance the night did not want. Men's voices answered with names. Someone called Ruthie, and Eulalie's heart turned itself inside out and then back again. It was Alma's voice, torn into realness. The dogs came. They swirled the base of the cypress, confused by the story the mud told. A hound put his nose near Eulalie's calf and then sneezed, offended by leaf and river and woman all in one. The men crashed past, cursing. The sheriff called out to fan left. The young rider bragged that he could beat the dark like a game. Mr. Vivian told the watch to be patient. They might have passed. They might have passed if not for the baby. Above the yard, a thin wail tore the night, Joseph, awake and learning grief. Someone shook him wrong. Eulalie's body remembered the weight of him, milk sour and miraculous. Her throat burned. She pressed her forehead to the bark and told herself to be tree. She nearly was. A twig snapped under Harlan's foot. The nearest hound whipped around and bayed. The bay was the color of brass. Men turned. Eulalie felt the decision rise in her like yeast. She reached into her bodice and pulled the folded pass. She pressed it into Dory's hand. "If I turn," she whispered, "you go. You go fast. You be the story that don't get written by them." "No," Dory said, a simple word that moved a whole country inside it. "Yes," Eulalie said, and stood, and stepped from the cypress into the road where moonlight could find her face. The dogs froze for the beat it takes to decide whether a person standing is prey. The men yelled. The sheriff lifted his hand. Mr. Vivian did not, he watched. Eulalie lifted her arms out from her sides so they would see she held no weapon but the oldest one, a body that refuses to kneel. She said, in a voice that would carry, "Tom." She said his name like a recipe that doesn't forget its salt. He swung his horse to face her. "You," he said, and the word had a whip in its tail. "You been busy." "I been cooking," she said, and that was the truth. "I been counting." She stepped forward one pace. "And I come to make a trade." The sheriff laughed in surprise. Mr. Vivian's eyebrows moved the way a surgeon's hands do when presented with an unusual wound. "Alma, somewhere in the dark behind the men," said Eulalie, as if tasting a friend's name and not knowing whether to swallow. "Trade?" Tom said, delight flat as a pond in his voice. "What you got to trade that I want?" "Your life," she said, and the night went very still to hear whether she was the kind of liar the world makes room for. He leaned from the saddle, amused. "My life? You eat at my hand," she said softly. "You always have. You will again." She looked at the sheriff. "You too." She looked at Mr. Vivian. "You chose not to. Wise. You keep choosing wise. Maybe you live to count other men's breaths tomorrow." She took another step. Her feet did not shake now. "Let me walk into that hedge with the woman you took and the boy you would set to field and not to school. Let me go, and the recipe stops where it is. Call me back, and it continues. You feel it now, don't you? In the place under the jaw? In the way the world goes light and then too heavy? You call me back, and it's going to keep cooking." Tom laughed, but the laugh had to go uphill. He pressed a hand to his belly like a man remembering supper. The sheriff stopped laughing. One of the hounds sat down and looked at the moon as if asking her opinion. Mr. Vivian said, very quiet, "What did you use?" He said it the way a man asks about an investment he cannot yet see the shape of. Eulalie smiled without teeth. "Angelica." She let the word go into the air and sit there, sweet. She did not say what cousin had come to supper and borrowed clothes. And patience. And letters. And counting. And the smallest spoon. Alma sobbed. It was the sound a ribbon makes when it is pulled too tight around a breathing thing. "Tom," she said. "Tom, do something." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time since she had become his wife. Then he looked at Eulalie and saw her for the first time since she had become his cook. In that moment, there was something like respect and something like hatred in him, and they looked like each other in the porch light. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked down at his hands, as if searching them for a tool that would make the night agree. He said, "Sheriff. Take her." The sheriff did not move. He was pale in the way of men who discover their bodies in public. "Maybe we talk," he said. "Maybe she tell us what to do about it." Mr. Vivian spoke without moving anything but the hinge of his mouth. "You have a talent, Eulalie," he murmured. "One could use it." "I do," she said. "I can use it too." She took one more step. The dogs rose uncertain. The young rider shifted in his saddle, bravado leaking from him like beer from a slopped cup. He did not understand recipes. He understood only speed. "Let me pass," Eulalie said. "Count to 30 slow. Tie up your pride and put it on the porch. Don't come after. Don't send a letter. Don't sell any head you own for a week. You do, and the next time the kitchen serves you something sweet, you'll have to ask your God which way the spoon points." She lifted her chin. "You hear me?" Tom stared. The sheriff swallowed. Mr. Vivian's watch ticked in the pocket where it had always lived. The night held its breath because stories, like soups, need a still moment to decide their flavor. "Go on then," Tom said, to prove he was not afraid. "Go on, and we see if your recipe holds. We see if your counting does more than make a woman brave in the dark." Eulalie did not thank him. She did not look away. She stepped backward, one pace and then another, so they would not say later she ran. She felt the hedge kiss her shoulders. She felt Dory rise from the cypress, felt Harlan's hand catch her sleeve. She did not look at the house, but in the place behind her eyes she saw Ruthie holding the baby like a door held against wind. She whispered, "Now," and they turned, and the hedge received them, in the dark, which had been listening like a tired but patient friend, at last said yes. The last thing she heard before the leaves closed was the sheriff's breath snagging like a ribbon on a nail and Tom's voice trying to be bigger than his body and Mr. Vivian's watch making a sound like. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Like a watch losing its spring. The hedge closed behind Eulalie, and with it the porch, and with the porch the men who mistook their voices for law. Leaves brushed her cheek with the cool of river coins. Harlan tugged her sleeve once, a small yes in the dark. Dory's breath was all gravel and will, a woman's heart pushing a broken body by saying you are not done yet. They did not run, they bent. Eulalie moved as she had taught herself to move in kitchens when pots of scalding liquid swung at elbow height and men with hot tempers came through doors without warning. 3 steps, listen, 2 steps, count, 1 step, decide. Behind, the sheriff's orders tangled with the dogs until all of it sounded like a storm picking through an orchard for something it could name as damage. In the ditch by the second sycamore, they sank to their knees. Mud lifted its hands to hold them. Eulalie tasted iron and licorice, fear sharp and Angelica sweet, on the back of her tongue. She pressed her palm over the folded pass in Dory's fist and felt the thrum of a document that had belonged to one life and might yet be asked to sponsor another. Paper is a thin door, some nights, it is the only one that opens. Harlan leaned his head close. We can't keep the road, he whispered. They'll lantern it soon. Not the road, Eulalie said. The river treats everybody the same. Men don't. She looked to where the creek broadened to the river's first seriousness. The surface was slick as a lie told by a confident man. We go along it and change our names in the water. Dory gripped her hand. If I falter, she said, you leave me and make my walking worth it. Eulalie shook her head so little that only courage could have seen it. I don't cook half a pot, she said. If it's on the fire, it finishes. They slid along the bank, feet finding hollows as if they had been dug for them. The frogs, opinionated, argued among themselves and announced nothing to men. Crickets wrote the minutes of the night's meeting. A barred owl threw out a question and then swallowed its own answer. Eulalie counted, stems in a bundle, breaths between splashes, the seconds a lantern needs to cut distance into accusation. She thought of Ruthie's napkin boat in her palm, a childish shape that could ferry a name away. The first lanterns flared on the far side of the house, yellow as fresh yolk. Voices tested paths. Hooves scrambled. The sheriff tried to build a wall out of instructions. Mr. Vivian did not bark, his sound was a blade drawn slow. Tom Brass cursed at a geranium splashed by his own body's rebellion and found no man to punish for it. At a crook where the river chewed into the bank, a cypress knuckled down into black water and made with its roots a little room like a chapel for animals and the guilty. Eulalie ushered them into the damp pews and knelt, mud coming up past her ankles with the intimacy of a secret keeper. Take from your head what can float away, she said. Harlan slid off his cap. Dory untied the rag that kept her hair at peace and tucked it into her dress. Eulalie lifted the blue calico knot from her own coil of hair and pressed it flat against her breastbone under her shift so that if her name fell off her, color would remain. The river offered them a raft the way a stingy man offers a crust, grudgingly. A clotted mat of cane and fallen limbs lodged among the roots and made a platform thin as memory. Harlan tested it with one hand. It held like a truth nobody wanted to admit. We can belly it along, he breathed. Quiet. They eased onto the raft like people remembering the weight of their own bones. Eulalie felt the water through the cane and thought of simmering, how the pot at a low burble whispers yes to everything that asks. They pushed with their palms against the roots and drifted. The lanterns on the bank went small and then hid behind the trunks like embarrassed stars. Count, Eulalie whispered, and she meant more than numbers. She meant, count what you have that the night can use. Dory counted breath in, breath out. Harlan counted the beats it took a hound's cry to go thin. Eulalie counted recipes for a morning not promised. They moved until the house became only a knot in the dark and the voices were the kind that belonged to all river banks, men laughing, a woman singing a child towards sleep, somebody fighting with a door that sticks. When the raft caught on a sandbar, Harlan slid off and, shoulder deep, tugged it free with a grunt that did not call attention to itself. Dory's cough tried to rise and Eulalie's hand was already there, palm soft against her back, patting time. They came to a place where the river remembered being creek and the banks leaned in like friends who had gossips to tell. There, Eulalie signed with her chin, ash up the slope, into the privet, then east. Harlan nodded and pulled the raft toward a scene where water skated over stones. They crawled onto land that breathed leaf and damp and the old story of rot becoming life. Eulalie pressed her ear to the ground for a second. She did not know why, only that an older woman once told her that the earth itself sometimes warns, and she heard, very faint, the hollow gallop of a horse somewhere far, the way a memory arrives before you call it. East, she said. Remember, bend when you can. If a straight line offers itself, it's a trap. They walked among trees who wore the night comfortably. Time thinned into a rope Eulalie could pull when she needed more of it and let go when speed served. She felt her body as a ledger, each muscle an entry, debt and credit measured by breath. She had made a trade in the road. Now she paid for it with everything she could spare that did not lower the principle of their lives. Near dawn, the sky on the far side of the river grew the color of dishwater wine. Birds tested the new day with question marks. Dory staggered once and then twice and then sat abruptly with a soft curse. Rest, Eulalie said, though rest was a word with edges right now. Harlan scouted to the margin of a field, returned with a palm of blackberries and a face that had found a fence. Fence runs north-south, he said. 2 planks. Wire low. Road beyond. No light but sky. I see no man. Fence can be friend if it keeps dogs from liking our odor, Eulalie said. We follow it. We don't cross it. She turned to Dory. Eat. She pressed 3 berries to her friend's lips. Dory accepted them with the grace of the starving, each chew a decision to continue. They moved again at a pace that would not right itself in the dirt. Eulalie's feet had learned the difference between leaf that reports and leaf that keeps confidence. She chose the latter. When the fence turned east, she blessed the carpenters who had loved a straight line and asked for once that it serve her. They followed, crouched, the fence between them and the imagining of dogs. Full daylight came up shy and then all at once. In it, the world looked equal, trees and weeds and poor soil sharing one color of light. On the road, a cart rattled, the mule heaving its shoulders the way men do when they have been told to. The driver, a woman with a hat that had seen weather, saw 3 shapes in the ditch and did not shout. Instead, she spat into the weeds and said, without turning her head, if you don't want my eyes to have memory, you best be saplings 'stead of folk. And then, after 3 beats, there a stump 15 paces up with a hollow. Might be a cloth there. Might be dry bread. Lord willing, a flask with something that kicks from the inside. She clucked to the mule. You didn't hear me talk to the trees. Eulalie's throat tightened until even swallowing hurt. Bless you, ma'am, she whispered to the rut the cart left. The woman did not turn. That was a blessing, too. The stump was where she said. Inside the hollow, a cloth, homespun and lived in, wrapped a heel of bread and a piece of cheese so dry it argued before it surrendered. The flask was tin and held a mouthful of something that lit the throat and the chest and made joints remember youth. Dory sipped and coughed and had color again enough to manage the next bend. By noon, clouds piled like laundry and the humidity hung its weight from their shoulders. Eulalie's calico knot beat lightly against bone as if to count. Harlan walked with a stick he had found, not to strike, but to pilot the invisible, for the air itself was a river now and they were small boats upon it. They came to the place they had never named. It was not a place, exactly, but a fold in the land where the cypress and the cane agreed to pretend to be confused until men lost interest. There was a low shed there that had once housed tools and now, sometimes, housed decisions. Eulalie gave a bird call she had learned from Jeremiah's marks, and after a moment the door whispered an invitation. Inside, shadows moved like cautious friends. Big May rose from a barrel like a queen from a throne. The boy Zeke unfolded from the floor, all elbow and caution. Old Ben, who owned nothing but a scar and a song, sat up from against the wall. The little room smelled of old wood and the courage of people who had learned to store it in tight spaces where it would not spoil. "You did it," Big May said, and because that touched something raw in Eulalie, Big May drew her into arms that had lifted more weight than any man alive and did not expect thanks. "You did it, child." "Not child," Eulalie said, and laughed once, broken and real. "Not anybody's." Zeke closed the door, and in the soft dark Eulalie let herself sit. Dory collapsed to the floor with the relief of a shelf putting down a load. Harlan stood at the hinge, guarding because his body did not yet know that it could rest without permission. "We can't stay long," Eulalie said. "I made a bargain. It might be worth less than a handful of creek water." Men begin to feel better and their pride gets fever. "What you need?" Old Ben asked. His voice was rope and tobacco and a kindness so big it needed no words. "Shoes for Dory," Eulalie said. "A different dress if there is one. Something to pack under the bosom to give it a poor woman's slouch. I got a pass we can rewrite. We need a hand can shape letters like a storm did it." She looked at Zeke. "You still scratching?" He grinned. "Every chance I steal. I can make a J like a fish hook and an S that don't cry." "Good," Eulalie said, and took from her bodice the folded paper. "This says a man named Josiah go to the mill with flour. We make it say Dariah go to the mill with linen for mending." Sheriff's eyes don't hear, only stare, and he's seen this seal before at Mr. Vivian's table. He might trust it more than his own belly right now. She paused. "We go cross-county. We don't head for the river towns. We go to the teacher woman by the marsh, the one call herself Sister Vine, then to the preacher who don't ask whose God he borrows to get folks fed." Big May nodded slow. "You been keeping maps in your mind." "I been keeping recipes," Eulalie said. "A map just tells you the order to add things." While Zeke worked the letters with a goose quill stolen from Sunday, Big May bound Dory's feet in rags and slid her into a plain dress the color of surrender that would, for once, be a kind of armor. Old Ben handed Harlan a hat that had seen two owners and would happily know a third. Eulalie stripped her blue knot from under her shift and, with hands that shook, pinned it under Dory's collar. "For spine," she said. "Keep it," Dory protested. "It looks better on a woman who got to be brave in front of strangers," Eulalie said, and smiled with teeth, not at danger but at the thought of it turning its head and missing them. When the pass was done, Zeke held it up and squinted. "Reads like a man who might have been writing on a porch with his foot asleep," he said proudly. "It'll fool a law that's got a buzz in its ears." They ate what there was, a stew of nothing that tasted like everything because it was given, and by the time they rose the sky was bruised. Rain arrived the way a preacher visits an old woman, loud on the roof and soft at the door. They stepped into it with gratitude disguised as cursing. Water erases. Water hides smell. Water makes new in the way God is always promising and men rarely allow. They traveled by fields that pretended not to know them and through a grove where lightning had cut theology into the trunk and left its black calligraphy. Eulalie read nothing in that scar because she had learned that not all marks are meant for her. She read instead the lean of the grass, the travel of ant columns, the way a crow folded itself twice before settling, the small scripture of the living. Near dusk, they reached the marsh Sister Vine kept as if it were a school and a church and a kitchen all at once. The house was no bigger than a verse, but its roof kept everything that mattered dry. Sister Vine met them at the edge of the reeds with a staff because kindness does not mean foolishness. She was tiny and wore a head wrap like a crown she refused to stop polishing. "Lord, I wondered when the river would carry you to me," she said to Eulalie, as if they had made an appointment in dreams. "You bring a sickness with you and a cure, by the look." Eulalie bowed her head. "We bring men who will come looking in a choice I can't unchoose." "Most choices worth salt are that way," Sister Vine said. She sniffed the air. "You been cooking in some white lady's fancy kitchen. You smell of sugar that thinks it too good for beans." Eulalie laughed, the sound surprised out of her. "True." Sister Vine led them into the school of reeds. Children watched from the door as if a story had grown legs. A boy named Jonah, who read by touching the cracks in whelk shells, ran to fetch water. A girl, Pearl, taller than her hunger, set a pot on. Sister Vine's husband, called Brother because his given name had been sold and he had chosen relationship over letters, opened a chest and took out a wrapped packet. "Rye bread," he said. "Blue eggs from our hen that refused to believe she ain't peacock." He set them on the table like treasures. "You eat, you tell, you sleep with one eye. I got long ears in the palmetto and a man 2 miles off who keeps count of every rider that throws dust." Around the table, Eulalie told the story as far as it needed telling: the Angelica syrup with a cousin in it, Alma's bright glad hands, the sheriff's spoon, Tom's belt, the keys, the cellar, the pass, the cypress, the bargain in the road. She spoke like a woman reading a recipe she had written in a time when flour was counted in tears. She left out what did not serve. She let silence season the rest. Sister Vine listened with her mouth set. "You didn't steal a man's breath," she said when Eulalie had finished. "You just told his body what it already knew, that it ain't king. You gave it a nudge." She looked at Brother. "Gonna be a reckoning." Brother nodded. "Reckonings walk slow but they got good shoes." That night, thunder kept the men home and lovers' quarrels were postponed by weather. Eulalie slept 3 inches deep and woke to the sound of a pot lid chattering. The smell was peas and ham bone and a story you tell children to make them brave for dentist chairs. She rose and found Sister Vine stirring with a spoon long as a sermon. "Eat," Sister Vine said, without looking. "The day gone ask you to do arithmetic with your courage. I don't like math without breakfast." Eulalie ate, and with each bite the ledger inside her straightened. When the bowl was empty, she set it down with care. "I can't run anymore," she said. "Running is a kind of cooking too, fast fire, but I need a slow heat now. I gotta turn what's happened into something that can feed more than 3 people." Sister Vine's eyes lit. "You thinking?" Eulalie nodded. "Tom don't fear bullets. Vivian don't fear loss, he writes. The sheriff fear losing face. There one thing all of them fear more than death." "What's that?" "Shame," Eulalie said. "A story that owns their names but they don't own the telling." Sister Vine smiled like a knife that's done hard work and earned oil. "You righteous wicked," she said, "admiration is blessing. What you need?" "Paper," Eulalie said. "Ink. Hands that can shape letters that make men flinch. I can read enough to check sense. I can't write fast enough to set a fire. Zeke can. Maybe Pearl. Maybe Jonah in his way." She paused. "And we need mouths. Women who sell eggs. Men who shoe horses. The postmaster's niece who gossip as if it were medicine. We need 10 places in a day to hear the same story told, not about what I did but about what they did." Brother rubbed his chin. "Dangerous," he said. "But danger live here anyway. Might as well move it into a chair." They set to work like a kitchen at Christmas. Eulalie dictated and Zeke wrote with his fishhook J and his uncrying S while Pearl sanded the lines with the carefulness she'd learned from dropping flour over batter to make it behave. Jonah traced the words with his finger as if they were the seams of a shell. Sister Vine edited for music. Brother folded the papers when they dried and tucked them into sacks that did not look hungry. The pamphlet was not long. It did not claim to be law. It did not ask permission. It said this: "On the evening past, at the house of the overseer Thomas Brass under the planter Mr. Vivian's eye, a table was set with Angelica and hypocrisy. Men ate who had bought people. A sheriff ate who had taken money. A woman who cooked with skill and mercy placed before them a small mirror and asked, 'Do you see yourselves?' The mirror answered in their guts. Some were made weak enough to hear God, some merely sick enough to curse. In that confusion, a woman unjustly bound was brought up from a cellar and the key returned to justice. If there is to be sickness, let it be the kind that cures. If there is to be law, let it be the kind that binds the hands raised to sell. If there is to be fear, let it be in men who deserve it." Signed, Nobody, which is to say everybody. They printed, hand-copied, really, until wrists ached and ink made a map on fingers. Sister Vine sent Pearl west and Jonah north with bundles tied inside baskets of collards and eggs. Brother took the road to the ferry and left papers under benches where men pretend to sleep when they are listening hardest. Zeke slipped into the town and slid a copy under the door of the newspaper man who loved scandal more than he loved his wife. Harlan, who had grown 3 inches in a night by standing guard over something he wanted to love, begged to carry some. Eulalie looked at him long. "You go with old Ben," she said. "Stay to shadows. If you see a lawman, become a post. If you see Tom, become a cloud." "And you?" he asked. "I go to Alma," Eulalie said. Sister Vine frowned. "You crazy. That woman wrap ribbons around wolves and call it kindness." "She's a door," Eulalie said. "She don't know it. But she is." It was her hands carried the tray. Vanity can be turned like sugar into candy. "I'm going to set it." She wrapped herself in a shawl that had belonged to Sister Vine's mother, a color of dusk that would not remember every stain. She took nothing else but a loaf wrapped in a cloth and the pass with Dariah on it, tucked now against her own breast again to be a reminder of what letters can do and cannot. She walked out when the road was pretending to be empty. At the house, the geraniums were bruised and the porch had vomit rinsed from its corners. Men's voices were brittle with last night's lost courage. Alma sat in a chair by the window, a wet cloth pressed to her forehead as if grief were a fever she might trick. Ruthie stood near, chin sticky, eyes great, the baby asleep in a basket with a hand still clenched like a bud around a thread of Eulalie's apron she had torn the day before. Alma saw her and started as if a ghost had come to sit on the settee. "You," she said, not unkindly, not kindly, but in the tone people use for a person they had assumed did not have an afterlife. "How dare," she stopped. Her mouth trembled. "Tom is ill." "I know," Eulalie said. "He will live." She did not add, "if his pride allows it." Alma's eyes went to the loaf in Eulalie's hands with a hunger that had nothing to do with hunger. "What is that?" she asked, as if seeing bread for the first time. "Peace," Eulalie said. "Or the beginnings of it." She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Miss Alma, you got a choice. You can be the woman who calls men to punish, or you can be the woman who tells other women the truth. Tom is sick because he puts his mouth wherever it pleases him, and last night your house ate its own cruelty and choked. He sent a woman to a cellar. He meant to sell her tomorrow. Your girl saw keys change hands. The law ate and laughed. Your name is in a mouth you don't control. But you could. You could say you have had enough. You could call wives. You could tell them not to send their men to Mr. Vivian's table, not to buy cloth from his store, not to let the sheriff step on their porches without wiping his boots. You want to be a lady? Be the kind that changes what the word means." Alma's hand tightened on the cloth. "You think I have that power?" she whispered. "Yes," Eulalie said. "Because you have gossip. Because you have calling cards and a piano and a voice that men allow to be loud when it flatters them. Turn it. Use it to shave them instead." She set the loaf in Alma's lap. "This is bread I learned from a woman who used to bake for a church that told her to sit in the back. It will feed your children and your courage. Don't serve it to your husband." Ruthie's eyes shone like water finding light. "Will you come back?" she asked. It was a question children learned to stop asking. Ruthie had not yet learned, which is why her asking cut Eulalie to the bone. "When the road says yes," Eulalie said. She reached to touch the baby's small knuckles and did not. "Hold your brother when the men get loud," she said instead. "Sing him the boat song." Alma drew a breath and, for the first time since Eulalie had known her, did not arrange her face for display. "What will happen to you?" "Something," Eulalie said. "But it will be something I cooked. Not something handed to me like a plate I didn't order." She turned and walked out because to stay would be to begin a sermon when the time needed a letter. On the road back to the marsh, a cart rattled up beside her. The driver tipped his hat. "You the cook?" he asked, as if asking whether she were the morning. "I am a woman who cooks," she said. He grinned. "Same thing, far as I care. I'm the newspaper man's boy. He sent me to find an Eulalie who knows more about pots than most know about sin." He held up a sheet, the pamphlet, now reborn as a broadside with a headline bigger than any law. "Beneath Angelica, a supper of justice. He say folks are ripping copies off his door." Eulalie took the paper. Her name was not there. Her name didn't need to be. "Tell your master to sharpen his ink," she said. "He going to need it." By the time she shaved across the marsh grass, 3 women had already arrived at Sister Vine's with faces like questions turning into plans. By evening, 6. By the following dawn, 10. They came with eggs, collards, information. "My man said the sheriff looked green the whole service," one whispered. "Mrs. Fulton told me Mr. Vivian didn't take his coffee. He drank milk like a child," said another with unkind joy. "They say 2 hands didn't show up for roll on the river place," said a third, "and I pray they are in a ditch laughing at us all." Eulalie stood at the table and began to make assignments the way she would assign chopping and stirring. "You, send word to the free woman with the seamstress shop. She got a niece who can place a line in a hem that makes men hear themselves wrong. You, make a basket for the sheriff's wife and put in it food that needs chewing, so she notice how hard work is. You, go to the Negro preacher by the crossing and say a woman will come to his kitchen to teach bread if he will let her teach letters. You, send to the riverbank tonight with a lantern down low, 3 winks, and then wait." They scattered. Leadership had settled on her shoulders not like a cloak but like her own skin, something she had been wearing unawares and now recognized as hers to mend and oil. News traveled on gossip's legs. Mr. Vivian sent for the newspaper man to threaten him, and the newspaper man printed the threat like a confession and sold out by morning. The sheriff put a hand on his pride and pretended it was his stomach and stayed home 2 days, during which his deputy stopped 3 sales and called them postponements. Tom Brass took to his bed and shouted orders through Alma, who brought them to the porch and built a bonfire of them in a small brazier, warming her hands over a heat Eulalie felt across town. With the fetching and the sending and the feeding, Eulalie took the kitchen at the preacher's house and transformed it. She did not do it with new spoons. She did it with how she told girls to hold knives and boys to wash in water that looked back at them. She taught them to count cups and then to count letters and then to turn letters into receipts and recipes and then petitions and finally into a notice that said, "On Sunday next, we will lay down our work at noon. We will not pick up axe, plow, ledger, or whip until Monday moonrise. If asked why, we will say we are ill. If asked what ill, we will say the kind that comes from eating at tables where men's souls are not welcome." Nobody signed. Everybody did. Men laughed when they first heard. Then a wife declined to lace boots on a husband's feet. A cook shook her head at a pot. A groom sat on the fence and sang to a horse. At the Vivian place, men stood in a field and listened to the bugs until shame started to itch them under the collar. Mr. Vivian came out with his watch and shouted about contracts. The sheriff rode over and told him a law against sickness would be a hard one to write. Tom tried to get up and fell back and ached for a thing he did not have a name for. Eulalie did. It was humility. It sits like a bowl under a spigot and waits. Sunday noon, the world leaned. A silence not empty but full, like a pot resting after boil, settled across the county. Alma played scales on her piano because her fingers wanted to hit something that would sing. Ruthie sang the boat song. The baby slept with his hand open. At the preacher's, Eulalie stood with Sister Vine and watched the road. "This one day won't save nobody," Sister Vine said, "because truth keeps even good women from making gods out of gestures." "I know," Eulalie said. "But it's a recipe. First you teach a mouth how to chew. Later you teach it how to speak." By dusk, the laydown day had 1,000 versions. In one, a man napped on purpose beneath a wagon and woke to find his wife had braided his hair with tiny shells like a boy. In another, a girl sat by the river and read a page of the newspaper aloud to a fish. In theirs, Eulalie and Sister Vine opened the shed and fed anyone who came, the pot spoon traveling from hand to hand like a baton passing the song. The week after, Mr. Vivian filed papers in town to have Eulalie arrested for insurrection. The judge read the petition and, because his wife's sister had been in his parlor when Alma told it, the judge wiped his glasses and said he saw no insurrection in a woman's cooking. "Women cook," he said dryly. "Sometimes men get stomachaches. Perhaps the men should chew their food." The clerk copied that into the record because sometimes the law does an accidental kindness. Tom took to walking with a cane, not because he needed it but because it told a story he liked, in which he had been attacked by forces beyond himself and therefore was noble. Alma purchased a ribbon for the cane. Ruthie hid the ribbon behind the clock. The baby learned to laugh when Eulalie's name was said, which meant Tom had to stop saying it in the house. In the quiet that followed the noise, Eulalie felt what reckoning really is, not a shout, not a rope, but a room that stands after a storm, walls damp, a roof that needs tending, and inside it the tables that must be set for a long dinner where the guests are consequences. She sat in that room and wrote new recipes. One was for bread that lasted a week and felt good in the hand of a person running. Another was for a tea that soothed nerves without stealing alertness, made from lemon balm and sassafras and a leaf Sister Vine would not name in front of men. A third was for a letter to the north, to a woman of a friend who operated a line that called itself underground and was, in truth, a line of faces and hands and kettles boiling at the right time. Eulalie wrote to her with Jonah's shell-reading finger guiding her in the dark places of spelling. She told no story of poisoning. She told a story of medicine, of sickness finding the right body to heal. The line answered. It did not arrive in words first, but in a man with boots that looked like they had been given to him by a brother and a cap set low over eyes that had learned to keep information. He stood at the edge of the marsh and said, "I'm called Rowan. I can build a boat from boards and a scripture verse. I hear a kitchen here knows tides." Eulalie offered him stew and a lie that tasted good. "We're just women minding pots," she said. He grinned without looking up. "Them the ones who turn a country." From then, nights had other work. Eulalie learned the river's voices the way she had learned men's, how a slap against a root meant the water was yawning, how a hiss meant sandbar, how a giggle meant a branch was lying. She learned where dogs didn't like to go and how to lay a cloth soaked in vinegar across a trail to confuse noses. She taught Dory to read the first letter of her new name. She taught Harlan the constellations that don't move and the ones that do and how both have their uses. Once, on a night pushed black by clouds, they pulled a flatboat with 3 souls curled in it past a place where Mr. Vivian's men sat with a lantern and a jug. One man sang. Another told a story about a boy who had drowned there last year. "Fool never learn the river," he said. "River don't forgive." Eulalie placed her palm flat on the water's skin and said in her heart, "Forgive us our passages." The boat slid by, a shadow wearing a quieter shadow, and Eulalie could hear the breathing of the woman under the quilt and knew it to be the same rhythm as a pot at a steady simmer. Morning after morning, Eulalie returned not to the house she had left but to a world she had helped mix. She stood in the preacher's kitchen and taught. Old Ben sang while grinding corn. Sister Vine sprinkled letters like salt. Pearls S. began to cry again, only this time, on purpose, to teach the little ones what sound it made. Harlan's posture said hoarse even when he was standing. Dory bent over boys and girls and showed them how to pinch close the seam of a hand pie so it would not betray its contents, and then told them how to pinch close the seam of a story so it would keep heat and do good. It could not last without clash. Nothing good does. Word came that Mr. Vivian had secured a warrant, not for poisoning, which would indict him as fool at his own table, but for theft of company property. The property in question was a woman named Dory and a boy named Harlan. "He mean to take us back by calling us objects," Dory said, rolling up her sleeves like a river before a storm. "We ain't objects," Harlan said, the new man in his voice giving the old boy a place to rest. Eulalie put on the shawl of dusk and said, "We meet them where everybody can see. We make a table in the yard of the courthouse and we feed whoever comes. We feed the sheriff. We feed Mr. Vivian if his pride lets him eat in public. And we put under the plates the words the judge wrote about chewing. If they want to call the law, let the law call them back. Sister Vine cackled. A supper summons, she said. That's church with napkins. On the day chosen, the courthouse yard filled as if Sunday had come 2 days late. Eulalie set kettles like drums. Big May carved pork with the reverence of a surgeon saving a limb. Old Ben sang a song nobody knew but everybody knew how to hum to. Alma arrived with Ruthie and the baby. She wore no ribbon. She carried spoons. The sheriff came pale but upright, his hat in his hands like a confession. Mr. Vivian came with his watch and a suit that thought it could intimidate air. Tom did not come, his cane had a headache. Eulalie ladled stew for the sheriff and set in front of him not a plate but a little card with the judge's line copied in Zeke's hand, perhaps the men should chew their food. The sheriff read and almost smiled. He ate and kept his body as calm as a pond out of respect for himself. She ladled for Mr. Vivian and set in front of him a card that read, Law that binds hands raised to sell. He lifted his spoon and then put it down as if puzzled by its weight. You ain't afraid? He asked her under the noise. I've been afraid since I was born, Eulalie said. I got bored of it. He studied her the way a man examines a coin to see if it is real or theater. Pride did math in him. He ate 3 spoons and stopped at 4. You could have been useful, he said, which men think is a kindness and is, sometimes, a threat. I am, she said, and turned to serve someone whose thank you would not be a chain. He raised the warrant like theater at last and called the sheriff to do his work. The sheriff read it aloud because paper makes men brave in certain silly ways. Dory, called property, he said, and his voice did not break, but it did bend. He looked at Ruthie's face and then at Alma's empty ribbon neck and then at the judge's wife, who stood with a spoon and borrowed courage. He folded the warrant once and handed it back to Mr. Vivian. Paper's got misprints, he said. My reading says woman, not property. And if I'm wrong, God and the judge can whop me later. A stir went through the yard. It sounded like a stew accepting salt. Mr. Vivian blazed and then remembered the rain of pamphlets and the lay-down day and the hymn with a new line and his own wife's refusal to lace his boots that morning, and he did what powerful men do when they see they are about to lose a little. He climbed a barrel and threatened to light the law on fire. Sir, the judge said mildly from the steps, because he had come out for stew and found a public, if you light the law on fire, try to stand downwind. The yard laughed. Laughter is not justice. It is a door. Eulalie stood with Dory and Harlan and felt the rope that had tied this county pull taut and then slackened by 1 notch. Not freedom. Not yet. But a loosening you could breathe through. That night they ate thin slices of triumph and went back to work. Work was the point. They ferried 3 more across, and Sister Vine christened Eulalie's kitchen with a new name, the Table That Moves. Rowan brought nails for a bigger flatboat. Old Ben taught Harlan the song a river likes when you need it to think you not there. Alma sent flour by the hands of women without letters. Ruthie tucked napkin boats with different names into the pockets of men who would not meet her eyes. Once, a rider with reckless hat, the same, Eulalie thought, whose sack had nearly undone them, rode to the marsh at dusk and called out eagerness he believed was danger. I come with a message, he said. Mr. Vivian say there's a bounty. Rowan's hands tightened without moving. Sister Vine appeared with a pie. Honey, she said to the rider, voice a quilt, you say bounty like you expect men to lick their lips. You come in and eat this peach pie I made from fruit a wind gave me, and you tell me who in your house wants shoes. I can make shoes from fabric if a boy is gentle with them. And then you carry back to your boss man this, if he lays a hand on the cook's friends, every table he hopes to set for the rest of his life, a fly-gone visit right when the preacher bow his head. The rider laughed, then stopped, then ate pie. He said the shoes would be welcome. He rode away with less hat and more thought. Seasons turned with a creak and a sigh. The marsh grass browned and then sharpened green again as if it were an argument that learned something. People left, people came, people left to carry others farther, some fell, some were caught, some were not. The pamphlet's first words turned into a song children tapped with spoons. Eulalie's name was not in the newspapers, and that was good. It was in kitchens and on porches and under breaths and in the river's smooth parts. Then the war came nearer, not quite like a boot on a neck yet, but a practice step. Men in uniforms moved through, bothering hens that had done no harm. Mr. Vivian found new contracts to sign with a different government and signed them with his same pen. Tom's cane became a weapon again. The sheriff stayed pale and learned to like his porch. Alma bought no ribbons that winter, and Ruthie learned to write her name in the steam on a window and then wipe it before anyone saw. Eulalie stood in her school kitchen church and felt a choice coming like a thunderhead. Sister Vine felt it too. She leaned her staff against the door and said, "You ready to move the table farther?" Eulalie looked at Dory, at Harlan, at Pearl now grown into a woman with flour on her shoulder like a badge, at Jonah with a newspaper held to his finger so he could read it out loud with his eyes closed. "I am," she said. "But I won't leave it behind. This table goes where I go." They packed what moved: kettles, knives with handles worn to their hands, the recipes stitched in hair and paper in memory, the hymn with the new line, the judge's sentence copied 100 times by 100 fingers, the habit of counting before acting. They left behind a shed that had learned to be brave and a marsh that could keep a secret. On the night before the biggest ferrying yet, a family of 5 and a man with a scar like a road across his back and a girl who had carried a book inside her dress for 3 years, Eulalie walked to the cypress by herself. The water breathed beneath the roots, accepting and impartial. She cupped it with both hands and let it go and watched it rejoin itself as if it had never been her guest. "I don't ask for safety," she whispered to the dark. "I ask for usefulness and the kind of end that tells the truth about the middle." The night kept its counsel. A heron stalked in the shallows like a priest with no congregation. Somewhere, a dog set up a bark and then, as if shushed by the river, reconsidered its vocation. Rowan met her on the bank with a coil of rope. "We good?" he asked. "We are what we made," Eulalie said. "We'll see if the world accepts the cake." They pushed off. The flatboat went quiet into the throat of the river. Behind, Sister Vine's lamp winked once, twice, thrice, the benediction and the dare. Ahead, the other side waited like a truth, there and not yet yours. Halfway, voices on the right bank, men in talk with liquor, slid toward the water on a plank of laughter. Rowan's pole hit a stone and tapped. Sound traveled. The laughter paused. "Who's there?" a voice called. It was a voice that had owned too many names and taken too few consequences. "A table that moves," Eulalie said, because she had decided long ago that if ever forced to choose between a lie that killed and a truth that risked, she would season the latter and serve it. Silence. A match scratched. Light flared on whiskers and confusion. "What?" Rowan bent and pushed and the boat slid like a thought you cannot catch. The light went small behind them. "We're clear," he whispered. They were not. On the left bank, hoofbeats. Not Mr. Vivian's men, uniforms. A patrol with a tired sergeant and a boy who missed his mother and a third man whose birth name had been Joseph and who had reasons to look hard at shadows. They rode to the water and sat, listening to what their orders had not told them about rivers. "Boat," the sergeant called. "Hold." Rowan's hands went still. Eulalie stood. The passengers curled tighter, their breath turning the air damp with terror. "What you carry?" the sergeant asked. Eulalie lifted her chin. "Heat," she said. "And bread." She lifted the loaf Sister Vine had pressed on her like a talisman. "And men who want to be men more than they want to be someone's reckoning." "Turn back," the sergeant said out of habit. His voice did not like the order it delivered. It sounded like a spoon scraping the bottom of a pot searching for something it had already given. Eulalie stepped to the gunwale. The flatboat shifted under her, the river did not. "Sergeant," she said, "you ever had a meal that made you see your mother? One where the beans came right, the fatback was just stingy enough, the bread broke with a sigh? You ever felt kinder after?" He hesitated. The boy behind him whispered, "Sarge," in a voice that held all the questions a boy asks at the edge of manhood. "We all starving," Joseph said. His name came out like a secret that had wanted air. We all are. The sergeant lifted his hand and dropped it. Eulalie waited to see if it meant stop or go. He did not clarify. That was his mercy. She nodded, to him, to the river, to the table that moves, and Rowan pushed and they slid like forgiveness past men who would later tell themselves a story about it that made their sleep possible. On the far bank, Hands and Weeds reached. The family went one way. The man with the road scar went another. The girl with the book pressed it into Eulalie's hand and said, "It's psalms and receipts and a birthing chant. It's yours now." "I'll keep it," Eulalie said, "because some offerings are burdens and some are holy and some are both." They moved the table again and again until moving was what it knew. The sheriff grew used to looking away at the right moments. Mr. Vivian learned to count different sums, losses, reputations, the cost of fighting a song. Alma learned that a woman's mouth changes a room when it quits working for a man. Ruthie grew up and wore no ribbons unless she had tied them herself. Eulalie's hair went salt at the temples like a road lightly frosted. Her hands thickened. Her eyes did not dim, they adjusted. She woke each morning to the ledger and balanced it not between good and evil, that accounting belonged to other books, but between use and waste. When she burned something, she named the waste and fed the chickens the lesson. Years later, enough years for boys to become fathers and for men who had laughed on porches to look down at their hands and ask why they were empty, the world turned publicly toward freedom in a way it had long been practicing in kitchens. Eulalie stood in a crowd where paper waved like birds. She did not cheer. She looked for those whose bodies did not yet know how to stand without a whip's future in their posture. She found them and pressed food in a list of names into their hands. "Here who you can go to," she said. "Here where you can eat. Here where a woman will watch your children while you find your feet. Here a man will shoe your mule for less than he could. Here not a preacher, just a man who knows how to say thank you with his eyes." Freedom came as a paper, like the past that had once changed names. It was good. It was thin. It needed broth and bread. Eulalie kept cooking. Once, on a bright ordinary morning, a carriage pulled up, polished, a watch with wheels. A man stepped down in a suit that tried to forget which contracts it had signed. Mr. Vivian, older now, pride moth-eaten, mouth no longer sure it owned the room when it entered. He stood in the yard of the table that moves and looked at the women and men and children eating from plates that did not owe him anything. "I came," he said, "to see if the kitchen I have heard about in the papers all these years is real." "It's a table," Eulalie said. "The kitchen is wherever the work happens." He nodded to a truth because sometimes even pride wants to die polite. "I suppose," he said. He held out a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "This is a book," he said. "Household Management from London." He tried to smile. "I thought you might find a use." Eulalie took it. She did not open it. "I will tear out the pages that do harm," she said, "and I will stew the rest into a gravy that makes sense in this climate." He laughed once, surprised into it, and then stopped as if the sound had been disloyal to an old god. "You ruined me," he said conversationally. "No," Eulalie said. "You did. I just held a mirror while you were eating." He looked around at faces he had not counted properly when they were in his ledgers. He saw in them something math does not master. He bowed the smallest bow a man like him still knows how to make and got back in his carriage and left his watch to the sun. Eulalie unwrapped the book. She set it on a shelf between the Psalms birthing book and a notebook stitched with hair. She cooked from it once, not to honor it, but to turn its nonsense into nourishment and to teach the girls how to read a recipe and ask whose kitchen it imagined. At night, when the tables were stacked and the floor was swept and the river lay flat as a ribbon ready for a new child's hair, Eulalie sat with Sister Vine and Dory and Harlan and the others and told the story of the Angelica one more time, not for glory, but so the lesson would not be lost to bragging or fear. She told it plain. She told of vanity and a tray. She told of a watch's chain and a sheriff's spoon. She told of a girl under a table with cream on her chin. She told of a past that could change names. She told of mud and cypress and dogs confused by the story the swamp told. She told of a bargain made in the road and held to not by a man's word but by a woman's resolve. "Would you do it again?" Pearl asked one night, wind in her voice like someone knocking at a door that is already open. Eulalie looked at her hands. They were not pretty. They were useful. "Yes," she said. "But I'd write a different recipe if I could. One where shame does the work without a single stomach having to carry it. But we use the spoons we have." She rose then to bank the fire. The coals looked like stars that had fallen into work. She spread them gentle and left them ready for morning, which is what leadership is. In the doorway, the river's breath moved the curtain in a voice, no one's and everyone's, seemed to say, "Keep the table moving." And they did. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.